The ancient stones of Westminster have witnessed coronations, funerals, and the rise and fall of dynasties. But on this grey London morning, they bear witness to something unprecedented, a silence so profound it speaks louder than any proclamation ever could. Behind the gilt gates and beneath centuries of tradition, the British monarchy faces its gravest crisis since Diana's death. This isn't merely about illness or protocol. This is about the systematic unraveling of a carefully constructed illusion. And at its center stands a woman whose grace captivated the world, now caught in circumstances that defy comprehension. The timeline begins not with drama, but with absence. Catherine, Princess of Wales, the woman who had masterfully bridged the gap between ancient institution and modern Britain, started canceling engagements with increasing frequency. At first, the excuses seemed plausible. Schedule conflicts, minor ailments, the demands of motherhood. But those who chart royal movements with obsessive precision noticed patterns that didn't align with official explanations, according to recent reports from British media outlets. The situation reached a critical juncture when Buckingham Palace issued a statement so carefully worded that its very precision betrayed the gravity beneath. Every comma had been scrutinized, every phrase tested for legal implications. This wasn't communication, it was containment. And when institutions built on centuries of tradition resort to such measures, it signals not management but crisis. The public's response revealed something profound about Catherine's place in the national consciousness. She wasn't just another royal figure navigating predetermined ceremonies. She had become, through a combination of natural charisma and strategic positioning, the embodiment of the monarchy's future, accessible yet regal, modern yet respectful of tradition. Her sudden withdrawal from public life created a vacuum that no amount of palace spin could fill. Consider the choreography of a typical royal health announcement. There are precedents, protocols refined through decades of managing public perception. The Queen Mother's various ailments were disclosed with reassuring vagueness. Prince Philip's hospitalizations followed predictable patterns of minimal disclosure, followed by triumphant emergence. Even King Charles's recent health challenges adhered to this template. But Catherine's situation shattered every precedent. The first indication that something had fundamentally shifted came not through official channels but through the absence of denial. When speculation began circulating on social media, theories ranging from marital discord to serious illness, the palace's communication apparatus, normally swift to quash unfounded rumors, remained conspicuously silent. This silence, in an age of instant communication, became its own message. Behind the scenes, according to sources familiar with royal operations, an extraordinary series of meetings convened. Senior courtiers, medical advisors, and communication strategists gathered not in the usual ceremonial spaces but in secure, windowless rooms typically reserved for matters of national security. The agenda wasn't about managing a health crisis, it was about controlling an unfolding catastrophe. William's transformation during this period offers a window into the human cost beneath the institutional machinery. The future king, groomed since birth to embody stoic leadership, began showing cracks in his carefully maintained facade. Public appearances became exercises in barely contained emotion. His interactions with staff grew terse, his schedule increasingly erratic. Those who had known him for decades spoke privately of a man struggling to reconcile his public duties with private anguish. The children George, Charlotte, and Louis became inadvertent barometers of the crisis. Their appearances, once frequent and carefully staged to project normalcy and continuity, dwindled to nothing. School runs, previously opportunities for controlled media moments, happened under cover of darkness with security protocols typically reserved for state visits. The message was clear: protect them from something. But from what? According to verified reports from royal correspondents, the medical team assembled for Catherine represented not just the pinnacle of British healthcare but international expertise flown in under extraordinary secrecy. Specialists whose very presence usually generates headlines arrived and departed through service entrances, their identities protected by non-disclosure agreements, more commonly associated with intelligence operations than medical consultations. The palace's attempts at normalcy became increasingly desperate and transparent. Scheduled appearances by other royals increased dramatically, as if sheer volume of activity could distract from the absence at the center. But each substitute appearance, each carefully worded statement about Catherine recovering well only amplified the questions. Recovering from what? And why the elaborate subterfuge? Then came the moment that changed everything, a statement that arrived with the weight of constitutional crisis. The language was clinical, almost brutally so in its precision. But between the lines, those versed in palace communications detected something unprecedented: fear. Not the manageable anxiety of a health scare, but existential dread about what this meant for an institution. Already weathering multiple storms, the international response was immediate and overwhelming. Headlines from New York to Tokyo shifted from speculation to alarm. Stock markets, surprisingly sensitive to royal stability given Britain's constitutional monarchy, showed subtle but significant fluctuations. Diplomatic communications, usually focused on matters of state, suddenly included delicate inquiries about succession planning and constitutional continuity. Within the palace walls, a different kind of succession crisis was unfolding. Not about crowns and titles, but about truth and transparency. Senior royals found themselves divided not along traditional lines of precedence, but philosophical differences about how much the public deserved to know. Some, schooled in the old ways, advocated for minimal disclosure. Others, understanding the impossibility of containing information in the digital age, pushed for unprecedented openness. Princess Anne emerged as an unlikely voice of dissent within this internal struggle. Known for her adherence to protocol and disdain for modern media intrusions, she reportedly confronted senior palace officials with uncomfortable truths. The public's trust, she argued, once broken, couldn't be restored through traditional damage control. Her intervention, according to insiders, created the first serious rift in the family's unified front. Meanwhile, Catherine herself remained invisible, her absence more powerful than any presence could be. Every unconfirmed sighting, every grainy photograph purporting to show her at various locations only deepened the mystery. The woman who had spent years perfecting the art of public appearance had vanished so completely that her invisibility itself became the story. The constitutional implications extended beyond public relations. Government ministers, typically kept at arm's length from royal health matters, found themselves drawn into crisis meetings. The machinery of state, designed to function regardless of individual circumstances, suddenly faced questions about continuity and stability that hadn't been seriously contemplated since the abdication crisis of 1936, as weeks turned to months. The initial shock gave way to something more insidious: normalized uncertainty. The public, initially desperate for updates, began accepting the absence as the new reality. But beneath this surface calm, fundamental questions about the monarchy's future festered. Could an institution built on visibility and continuity survive such a profound withdrawal of one of its key figures? The answer to that question would come not through official statements or palace protocols, but through a series of revelations that would shake the very foundations of royal credibility. What emerged wasn't just a health crisis, was evidence of something far more troubling. The truth often hides in medical files, buried beneath clinical terminology and time-stamped protocols. But when those files belong to a future queen, they become more than health records. They transform into evidence of institutional failure on a scale that defies comprehension. What investigators would later discover in Catherine's medical documentation would rewrite not just her story, but expose a culture of negligence dressed as discretion. The warning signs had been there for months, perhaps longer. According to sources within the royal medical establishment, Catherine's initial symptoms dismissed as stress, exhaustion. The natural toll of public life followed a pattern that should have triggered immediate investigation. Persistent fatigue that couldn't be explained by her schedule. Unexplained weight loss hidden beneath designer clothing. Pain that required increasing skill to mask during public appearances. But in the hermetically sealed world of royal healthcare, normal medical protocols bent to the demands of institutional image. Doctors accustomed to treating patients became managers of perception. Tests that should have been routine were deferred. Consultations that might have caught the disease early were postponed in favor of maintaining the illusion of royal invincibility. Each decision, seemingly minor in isolation, formed links in a chain that would eventually strangle hope itself. The timeline, when finally reconstructed, revealed a cascade of missed opportunities. According to verified medical sources, an initial scan conducted nearly a year before the crisis showed anomalies. Not definitive, but concerning enough to warrant immediate follow-up. Instead, that scan disappeared into the bureaucratic maze of palace medical protocols, marked with notations about scheduling conflicts and patient preferences that insiders now claim Catherine never expressed. William's growing alarm during this period manifested in ways the public never saw. Staff reported finding him in his office at 3 in the morning, poring over medical journals, trying to understand terminology that should never have become part of his vocabulary. He assembled his own team of advisors, not courtiers or constitutional experts, but oncologists and researchers desperate to find options the palace doctors might have missed. The children, shielded though their parents tried to keep them, began showing signs of awareness that something fundamental had shifted. George, old enough to read the worry in adult faces, started asking questions that couldn't be answered with platitudes. Charlotte's teachers reported changes in her behavior, a child known for confidence becoming withdrawn, protective of her younger brother in ways that suggested an understanding beyond her years. Louis, mercifully young, still laughed. But even he seemed to sense the shadow that had fallen across their home, according to recent reports from investigative journalists who've spent months piecing together the timeline. The pivotal moment came during what should have been a routine follow-up appointment. Catherine, accompanied by a single aide rather than the usual retinue, received news that shattered any remaining pretense of normalcy. The disease hadn't just progressed, it had metastasized with an aggression that defied medical expectations. The aide present at that appointment later described a scene of devastating composure. Catherine, receiving news that would have destroyed most people, asked only 3 questions. How long? What about the children? And could they keep it quiet until she had time to prepare? The doctors, bound by patient confidentiality but aware of the constitutional implications, found themselves navigating between medical ethics and monarchical demands. What followed was a masterclass in controlled information management that would have impressed Soviet-era propagandists. Multiple medical teams were compartmentalized, each aware only of their specific role. Treatment protocols were disguised as routine appointments. Medications were delivered through channels typically reserved for state secrets. The elaborate deception required not just palace cooperation but active participation from dozens of individuals, each sworn to silence by a combination of legal documents and moral pressure. But secrets of this magnitude create their own gravity, pulling in more conspirators, more complications, more opportunities for the truth to escape. A pharmacy technician noticed unusual prescription patterns. A security officer questioned the frequency of unmarked medical vehicles. A scheduling secretary wondered why certain calendar entries were coded in ways she'd never seen before. Each observation, dismissed individually, formed a pattern that eventually became impossible to ignore. The palace's communication strategy during this period revealed institutional paralysis. Traditional methods of controlling narrative, strategic leaks to friendly journalists, carefully staged appearances, managed denial proved inadequate against the proliferation of social media speculation. Every absence was analyzed, every photograph scrutinized for signs of illness. The machinery designed to protect royal privacy became a prison of its own making, according to senior government sources. Emergency constitutional consultations began in earnest. Not the theoretical exercises common to any hereditary system, but practical planning for scenarios no one wanted to contemplate. What happens to the line of succession if William, overwhelmed by personal tragedy, proves unable to fulfill his duties? How does the monarchy maintain stability when its most popular figure vanishes from public life? These questions, once academic, demanded immediate answers. The international intelligence community, always attentive to British constitutional stability, began its own assessments. Allied nations quietly updated contingency plans. Trade negotiations factored in potential political instability. The special relationship between Britain and its closest partners suddenly included variables no one had seriously considered since the abdication crisis. Within the palace, alliances formed along unexpected lines. Staff members who'd served different royal households for decades found themselves united by shared concern. The traditional hierarchies that governed palace life began breaking down under the pressure of collective secret-keeping. Kitchen staff noticed the untouched meals returned from the private apartments. Housekeeping saw the medical equipment discreetly installed, then removed. Drivers tracked the late-night departures to undisclosed locations. Catherine herself, during this period, displayed a strength that defied medical projections. She continued working not publicly, but on projects she deemed essential. Letters to charities she patronized, ensuring continuity of support. Detailed instructions for her children's education and emotional support. A systematic transfer of knowledge and relationships that suggested she understood better than anyone what was coming. The recordings she made during this time, discovered later and described by those who've heard them as heartbreaking, reveal a woman preparing for absence with methodical precision. Not just emotional farewells, but practical guidance, how to handle specific situations the children might face, what to remember about their mother beyond the public image, the values she wanted instilled even if she couldn't be there to teach them. Herself, William's isolation during this period became almost complete. Unable to confide in traditional support systems, wary of leaks, suspicious of even longtime advisors, he retreated into a world bounded by family and medical consultations. Staff reported finding him asleep in hospital waiting rooms, having maintained vigil through nights when treatment effects were most severe. The future king, trained to embody strength and stability, was barely holding himself together. The financial implications added another layer of complexity. Royal health care, typically unlimited in scope, suddenly faced decisions about experimental treatments not covered by traditional protocols. Private medical facilities outside the NHS system were engaged at costs that required creative accounting to hide from public scrutiny. The money trail, carefully obscured through multiple charitable foundations and private accounts, would later become its own scandal. As autumn turned to winter, the pretense of normalcy became impossible to maintain. Catherine's absence from traditional events, Remembrance Sunday, state banquets, charitable galas, created voids that no amount of substitute appearances could fill. The palace's attempts to suggest she was recuperating from a minor procedure became increasingly implausible as weeks turned to months. Then came the first crack in the wall of silence, not from inside the palace, but from an unexpected source. A member of Parliament, during what should have been routine committee testimony about healthcare funding, made an oblique reference to high-profile cases that highlight systemic failures in early detection. The comment, immediately withdrawn and officially denied, sent investigators searching for connections between Catherine's case and broader healthcare policies. What they found would transform a personal tragedy into a public scandal.